I would like to thank you for being part of our oral history project at the Institute of Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Lynda Letona. Today is October 29, 2013, and for the purposes of documentation, I'd like to ask you to state your full name, where you were born, where you grew up, and where you are living today.
So, Raina J. León. So just Raina J. León is usually what is there. Born in Philadelphia and grew up in Philadelphia.
Could you share with us how you came to poetry as a reader and as a writer?
I came to poetry as a reader and as a writer pretty young. So I started writing poetry when I was 8 years old. And it was the first poem that I ever wrote was in a 3rd grade English class. It was a diamante form, right? It's just 1 word, 2 words, and then it makes a little diamond. And for many years I held on to it and had a little photo album, right? Because it was so precious to me. This is something I created. And my mother was so proud as well because she's also a poet. And she had introduced me to a lot of great poets early on. I remember my first book that I was ever bought for me that I loved was a book of quotations, and some of them were, and then the second thing was a book of poems. And my mother also introduced me early on to the recordings of Nikki Giovanni and Last Poets, things that she had on records and would play them as if they were the music we could dance to, right? So I think that's how I came to reading and writing it.
What kind of music was that?
So Nikki Giovanni and Last Poets, and Last Poets definitely had some music in the background, but with Nikki Giovanni it was just her reading of poetry, and that was like our music, right?
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In a blog interview question related to your latest book, Boogeyman Dawn,
Mm-hmm.
you mention a focus on children, innocence, and the corruption loss of innocence. You say the book allows you to critique society, particularly in respect to education and in protecting the welfare of children. Poems like On the Football Field touch upon some of these issues, the shattering of innocence and the racial tensions that unfortunately make up part of the fabric of society.
Mm-hmm.
Before I go on to ask you questions about some of these matters, I was wondering if you could read us a poem.
Sure. On the football field.
Mm-hmm.
On the football field, Puertito. Huddled together, they transform a saint's flag, blue and white. Boys become Catholic fists, set to pummel each other into the burning belief that comes from a kind of flagellation. Somehow, catechism and all its mysteries linked to football plays. Ever the push forward, the faith that someone will catch and run. My brother slides into his position, a defensive tackle. Though small, he is built sturdy. He carries the beast as his nickname. He devours, claws, tramples down. In this game, the score is tight, 20-14, the other team just a touchdown away from winning. Time ticks on. The boys lock up, foot soldiers on either side. The jeers begin. That your mother over there, jumping up and down, looks just like a monkey. Another chimes in with sound. My brothers lurch forward, soon follows. Offsides. They line up again. Your sister is such a pretty piece of ass. Those babies would be fun to shoot. My brother begins to cry beneath his helmet. He is 10, if that, at the time. Where the fuck did you come from with a nigger family? And then the spit, more spit. He cannot wipe away the play begun. He sails to show them he is still steel. He tosses his whole body into tackling one boy after another. When the teams lock up, we off the field do not know why. Just see the play has stopped. The game is over, and my brother is jammed in the middle. We cannot see the punches from both sides. All my mother knows is my brother weeping off the field, throwing his helmet down and saying, never again. The coach will call, boys will be boys. You can't let him quit. We need him. To which she responds, "You can't protect him out there and he won't tell me what's happening. My son says he doesn't want to play. I won't force him." That was not the end of the fights. I thought he would be a priest someday, that gentle. The boys made him believe in something different, that his fists had more power than God.
Thank you. So this poem seems to explore relevant issues such as the pressure to perform, whether in the football field or otherwise, bullying, racism, sexism, and the struggle between the individual versus society. My first question is, do you think poetry can reconcile us to the wrongs committed, or are you less optimistic about the role poetry may play in addressing these issues?
I wish I could say that poetry will reconcile us. I'm a realist as well as an optimist. So I like the idea that poetry can spark conversation, and I don't know if it can change the world, but it can spark conversation between two people. And in that essence, I think it can change some things, the world between two people. I don't know, again, if it can change the greater society, but I hope that my work has some play in that it does have some play as far as the building of dialogue, the building of conversations, and through that, rippling out.
Do you consider your poetry as a poetry of advocacy and witness? And do you think being a poet who threads between two cultures has impacted your concerns or approach?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I do consider my work that of advocacy and witness, especially in this book, for young people. I don't think that we as a society do enough to protect our young people and to allow them to flourish in the ways that they are meant to flourish rather than the ways that we want them to be. I think that it's really important for me to bring voice to those subjects that I don't think that many people talk about. And for example, one of the poems in the book talks about child abuse. And when I was in North Carolina, I had a teacher. I was working in a teacher credentialing program. And the teacher comes to me and says, "Well, I'm observing this child, and I can see that there's abuse. And I've reported it, but I've been told by my supervisors that I have to observe and keep track of what's going on with this child for 6 weeks before anything can be done." And the idea that you have to watch this child go through horrors for 6 weeks and then something may be done, that's horrific. That's absolutely horrific. And I think that for me it was important to tell that story, to tell a little bit of that as far as from the child's perspective as well as the mandate kind of perspective of, what that must be like in my imagination to kind of suffer through those, what is surely a significant ordeal while others are watching and waiting. I think that it is very important, again, to have that voice, to talk about those things that nobody else will talk about. And then maybe something will change.
Well, thank you for sharing. What kind of impact did this poem have on you and or your readers after you wrote it?
On the football field?
Mm-hmm.
So when I wrote the poem, and it was hard to write, and even now, as I'm reading it, very much that image of my brother coming off the field is still very pressing, because he's my younger brother. He's, growing up in my family, we were told over and over, family is all you have. Your brother is all you have. So anything else, you could lose everything, but your brother is all you have. So to have still that image it's actually bringing me to tears right now. So when I read the poem, I wrote the poem and read it for the first time at the Acentos reading. I think it was 2007, 2008 at Hunter's College. AWP was there in New York. And I remember I was in such pain because I'd been really sick. I didn't know what was wrong with me at that point. Turns out I have a gazillion allergies, but I was really sick. So I got to New York, and I was in such pain. And go to the reading, and it's a marathon reading of 20-some people from all over, very different styles. And I read this poem, and I break down in the middle of it because that image just smacked me in the middle of reading this. I'm confronted with my peers. I'm reading this poem in front of a very packed audience, and the image just took over, and I was set to weeping. And eventually, there was applause to support. I read the poem, the rest of the poem, and I will never forget my friend Fish Vargas. He turned around and he's like, he held my hand. He's like, whatever the ills are, essentially, whatever the problems were, I just want to beat them down. I want to beat them into the concrete. And I was like, I love you, Fish. And then Martina's father, who was sitting right next to Fish, turns around and he just took my hand and he held it. And then afterwards, many of the people who were in the audience came up to me and they were like, you weren't the only one crying. You weren't the only one who was moved by this work. And I think that that's even more powerful. That's an incredible gift that the difficult situation has given me, and given us this ability to connect with one another within the word, within that space of the poem, and again to live within it, but to dialogue about it, to be emotively wrapped up in it, but not to be bound by it.
In these poems, there seems to be a strong sense of empathy towards the struggles of children and other victims. How did your own experience contribute to your desire to speak for these silent voices, whether growing up or currently in your role as educator or both?
So growing up, I had some rough experiences along the way. And it was interesting. My brother and I, when I was in college, my mother had come up for just to visit. My brother had come with her, and we went to the grocery store. And my brother and I were talking about all these abusive things in our childhoods. And my mother was like, how did I never know? Like, because it was a lot of things that happened with other family members. And my brother was like, yeah, this happened, and I remember that. And my mother was just absolutely dumbfounded, just had no idea about what we had lived through. And she was like, Raina, I would have gotten you help. And I was like, well, I appreciate that. But I survived, right? So with children now, I'm even more conscious of what may affect them and how to support them. And being an educator, being someone who does value that advocacy, that support of children and families, because those who perpetrated things on me, I think that people do the best that they can with what they have. And so if all you have are not the best parenting skills, not the best child rearing skills, that there are some that we need to be better and more involved as a society to help everyone, not to excuse what has been done at all, but to look at it in the complicated nature that it is, that it has. So I'm really conscious of supporting children, and that comes through, I think, in the book.
Your poem, Catholic Puberty Lessons, was another favorite. In it, I found an interesting exploration of puberty through a religious upbringing. There seems to be a generational struggle or a generational gap in the poem. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about that, and if your Catholic upbringing, as you noted in a blog interview, inspired the poem?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's very interesting too. Within that poem as well, there's definitely a generational gap. The things that one talks about as a woman, for my mother's generation to other women, versus those things that I talk about with my female friends, or the guidance that one receives It was like, really, that totally happened in the book, the poem. My mother really did give me a book that she borrowed from the library, a blue book, and was like, okay, here are all the answers that you need to know. Just read the book. It was like, my body is changing. I don't know what's going on, and you give me a book. It's like, okay, so now I've learned that I can't go to my mother. I have to go to books. I have to go to the library to find out what's happening. And I think that too was my relationship with my grandmother. It wasn't even a topic. It was like, okay, just pray. Just pray and everything will come to you. It's like, I am not a saint. I am not going to have visions about my body. This is not how it's going to be. So I think that there was this concept as far as even like the religion purity. You don't need to know these things because, you know, maybe when you're buried, you'll figure things out. I'm like, but it's your period. Like, come on, like really. So yeah. I think that it was not just religion, but also norms of behavior, the generational divide. Happily, some of that has broken down recently, but I'm an adult now, and we're just talking about these things. So,
Little too late.
Little too late. I figured things out. I'm okay.
So another favorite in Boogeyman Dawn is titled Persephone Returns.
Yes.
Would you be so kind to read it for us?
Sure. Persephone returns. Soot-black robes drag the red clay through narrow catacombs. No attendant's light to guide the flitter glance from the walls, where the bodies of men are split and chained apart, veins forever seeking wholeness across sharp-edged rocks. No, she sees these sinners with frozen mouths and hears their whisper screams, yet walks on with blue flame candle. The terrain of sin is tough and steep. She is judged with horrors and does not falter. Closer to the mouth of hell ride those who committed the smallest of errors, a stolen glance at a goddess bathing, a kiss between the cracks in a wall. Most pitiable, the head without a body that sings of lost love. Persephone weeps, for the man and girl she knew, the man brave and humble, begged his young wife back, and the girl smitten on her wedding day by a serpent's venom hiss. She offered Hades a further assurance that she would never leave for their freedom, a child of spring and flame. Her gift betrayed by true love, no hope of praise on the tongues of generations from this human marriage. She ascends and takes the seed. With slender hand she lifts the musician to lull the dog that blocks the gate, and rises far beyond the red-eyed beast, the twisted sinners, the touch of hell each night. But at the mouth, a pitch-black cave, she stops to consider the season before her, a wash of spring green and poppy flower red, sunflowers and dahlias, cleansing rivers, and nearby a bird in mid-song. No need for the candle to see that she has changed, been sullied by this affair. No need for Odysseus's voice to goad her to misery at the brink of joy. Purest Persephone, with child, weeps again for her plight, the damnable naivete, that first pomegranate promise, and she turns.
Thank you. I'm interested in your writing process for this poem and anything else you'd like to add?
Writing process for the poem. So with the poem, growing up as a child, I had a huge fixation on Greek mythology of all sorts, but Greek mythology especially. And I thought of that when I came to Mother Love, book by Rita Dove, which definitely explores this relationship between Demeter and Persephone, and the overbearing mother and the child wanting to find her own way, but the difficulties in that relationship back and forth. And so I became really enamored more so with the story of Persephone. And she's supposed to live in this underground world with her rapist or husband, depending on the interpretation of the story, for 6 months out of the year, or a certain number of months out of the year. And I always wondered, so other than the 6 seeds that she has to come back, well, she could fight that. She could. I want her to. Why does she stay? Why does she stay in this hell when she's supposed to be this epitome of beauty and spring and freedom, and that's when I created this alternative story where she's pregnant and then she sees all these things that she once was, and she goes back. And I wonder how many women too are in horrible situations, and as far as living situations with their partners, and they look at what might be, but they're scared of that, and they go back. So that all came through as far as the creation of this poem. That poem too is really heavy on the music within it, so I wanted to push that with the idea of Odysseus and this music that's so enchanting that you can't turn away from it. But at the end, he's a headless vehicle for music, and it's a music of mourning. It drives people mad. And so even within the music of the poem, there is a sorrow and definitely a loss, several losses throughout the poem, but again, it's driven by the music within it. So a lot of things that I was thinking about as I was writing it. But I think I wrote that one while I was in Tyrone Guthrie in Ireland, and it was this really peaceful place. But I couldn't sleep. I felt tormented by a lot of things that had to just come out, and that was one of the things that came out.
A melancholy music.
Yeah.
So, as a struggling graduate student, accumulating debt and seeing my close friends struggling in like manner, I was very interested and grateful for your sharing of your personal experience, particularly during a summer of hardship in North Carolina when you had been admitted to a PhD program. One of the questions you raised in a segment where we discussed the notion of the American dream was, quote, "Is the American dream getting the doctorate? Is the American dream also knowing that I will probably never own a home because of all the loans I have for that doctorate, knowing that the degree is a home I will never live in?" End quote. Then you end with, "Every discovery leads to another question for me, but I suppose that also leaves fodder for writing." In your biography, I noted that you did not mention your PhD degree, so I was wondering what your area of study was, and if you could expand on your reflections concerning the PhD. Was it worth the debts and hardships for you personally? What advice would you give a writing student who may be considering pursuing a PhD?
So the PhD is in education. The corruption of minds, that's my art. But corruption of minds for change, right? Transformation. That's my area of interest, especially in critical literacy. So taking the text and reading the world and reading the word within it. Critical pedagogy, which challenges us to reconsider power and how that plays out in the classroom. So was it worth it? It was worth it for me to learn. To be immersed in all these different areas of study. But it is the house that I will never live in. So as far as the debt load, and every now and then I think, okay, so why did I do this? And part of it, as far as a PhD, was not for me. It was for others, as far as thinking about, well, how can I help others? How can I support others in grant writing? The PhD comes in handy. That's the reality of it. And as far as research, well, I now know how to do some of the research that can help different community organizations and can push the arts in a way that I wasn't able to do before the PhD. That said, I'm definitely I love school, so have always loved school. When I was a kid, I would see the school bus go by and I would say, "Mommy, can I go? Like, when can I go?" And I'd be 3 years old. And my mother's like, "Can you give me a little time? I'm not ready for my child to go to school yet." But for years, I would say that, and it was only, I think she gave up at like 4. And so I went to school at that point. My grandmother was devastated, but because I stayed with her up until then. But was it worth it? And I think so. I hope so. I hope so. I hope that it will allow me to do some great work in collaboration with others. If I had advice for graduate students who are pursuing the PhD, whether in education or creative writing or whatever discipline, is to make sure that you get the support that you need to do it. And politic, enterprise, however you have to do that, but come out with as little debt as you possibly can. And I don't think, I just didn't have anyone to help me as far as the guidance in finding money and finding different programs. I think that if I could tell graduate students anything is to find a mentor who will also help you as far as identifying those resources, because they're out there. And I think that's one thing that I do now with my graduate students is to say, okay, well, what do you really want to do? Here's a program where you can be funded, if not fully, then close to fully, and come out with very little debt. Because it's hard to do work in education and in creative writing especially, because we just don't get paid a lot while still negotiating all of the debt load. And I think that sabotages the work.
And finally, in thinking about some of the textual sources of inspiration, you note sacred texts such as the Bible as being important in your formative years. What other texts inspired you or unsettled you? In what ways have they impacted your poetics?
Growing up or today?
Either.
Okay. Texts that inspire or upset. There are many. So, texts that inspire. So I remember going to Puerto Rico with my family, and we went to just a regular old pharmacy, Rite Aid kind of thing. I don't know if anyone knows Rite Aid. It's a pharmacy chain in Philadelphia. Okay. So like a pharmacy chain. And in the book section was a selection from Pablo Neruda, and it was in English and Spanish. And I would just buy this covered book, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I read through it, and I'm just like, oh, wow, this is love. This is love. I just became so fascinated with his work for years, and anything I could find was like gobbled up. So inspiring in a good way. Texts that upset. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a huge one for me that upsets me because it challenged me to think about the systems of oppression, especially within education, but within any institution, and how that oppression can be replicated over and over and over again without being checked. And then thinking about how to check that, how to counter that, the counter narratives. Jonathan Kosel's Savage Inequalities, and another education text that really upsets me, especially to see all the inequalities in education. Children who are going to school where their bathrooms literally don't work. Like, how do you go through a school day when there are hundreds of children and the bathrooms don't work? So that kind of thing. And as far as poetry, though, Martin Espada's work is always so inspiring to me and upsetting to me in a really changing way. Alabanza, for example, that poem, which talks about the World Trade Center and those stories of those who were in the restaurant at the top of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no hope that they're going to survive. And and at one point he conjures the spirits of those who died from that restaurant and those who also died in Afghanistan, and how they speak to one another even though they speak different languages. And that's a beautiful idea. It's an upsetting idea. And it also speaks to me about oppression. And Araceli Escarmay, she has this poem, Arroz Poética, which also talks about that. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. Is one of the lines within it. So things like that upset me. They are highly political, but in a way that says, okay, what can we do? What can I do to be more socially active? What can we do? What can I do to speak to some of these stories? Because they themselves are acting as witness, and should I not do the same? So
I love the persistence in Alabanza, and it seems like such a buildup of emotion.
Yes.
And
great.
the class consciousness. That's interesting that, I think of Rite Aid as this sort of like very generic, dry place, and it's amazing that you found your love there, in a Rite Aid.
I love that.
And then you went to get sherbet.
Right.
That's great. So on behalf of Letras Latinas at the University of Notre Dame, I would like to thank you for sharing your work and your thought with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is great. This is fantastic.
Great. Thank you.